Please join with me as we light our chalice together this morning with the words in your bulletin. We gaze.
We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in the celebration of the life we share together.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Go in amazement.
Last summer, I had the opportunity to take a walk in the woods with a little boy who wasn't quite halfway between 3 and 4. The boy and his parents were spending the weekend with me at my family's cottage up in Ontario. And unfortunately, as often happens, it was a rainy Saturday. And by early afternoon, all available indoor distractions had been exhausted. So I proposed a walk with this young lad in the soft, warm summer rain. And he bit. And we were on our way down the lane through the woods. And I followed his lead, as is wise to do when you're with a not quite 4-year-old. And the conversation ranged everything from Beethoven, the dog, to going out in the boat when it stopped raining. And on our way home, we passed a small little garden that marked a driveway that went into the other cottages, and we stopped for a minute and examined the daylilies and the marigolds and black-eyed that were there blooming, and then it started to rain a little bit harder. And my little friend looked up at me and said, almost, kind of to reassure me, that, well, that's okay. The rain needs the flowers. The rain needs the flowers. I resisted my adult temptation to correct him. The rain needs the flowers. Maybe there was nothing to correct anyhow. For all we know, the rain does need the flowers. Such wisdom as my little pal offered me may be one more good reason for us to walk gently on the earth. In this incredible, vast, incomprehensible universe where all is connected and all is one. Without the flowers, what is the point of the rain? If I had it to do over with this morning, I might have titled my sermon just a little bit differently, but as I was saying to Bill earlier, and Maureen, I'm sure as she knows as well, sermons start one place and end up in another. And usually the sermon title is needed long before that final process has been reached. So I kind of wish I had stolen a phrase from E.E. Cummings to title this. I might have called it Greenly Spirits, from that poem of his that begins, I thank you, God, for this most amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and the blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is infinite, which is natural, which is yes. The greenly spirits, they are what I hope to encourage this morning. On one of these spring mornings when ever so slowly, the wash of green infiltrates the landscape. Too often, being green, quote unquote, ends up feeling like an obligation. I suppose in some ways because it is an obligation. It is an ethical obligation. But when we do that, we often lose touch with some of the more primitive impulses that are within us, that are operating always somewhat below consciousness, that call us forward to serve and to sacrifice even for the good of this amazing interconnected web which holds us in our being. One of the things in ministry that they don't necessarily teach about, but that I've always kind of come to appreciate, is the importance in the religious life, the spiritual life, the congregational life, about the dynamic of balance, how balance plays off each side, and what that informs for us. Because I think that in that, finding that, striking that balance is where a kind of creative tension exists, and out of creativity, things always wonderful emerge. Whether that tension exists in a relationship that you have, or in an organization you're a part of, or simply the tension that exists in our own minds and our own ideas. Sort of this, oftentimes the conversations about being green sort of fits that kind of tension, that dynamic of balance, I think, in that we sit and we talk about the theory of being green and living responsibly on the earth, and then the actual practice. How do we actually make that happen? We talk about the facts of science and the role of imagination that lets us see Gaia as a living entity. We think about the role of duty and what we hold for future generations, and also we think of something more private in terms of what is our own sense of devotion to making a green life for ourselves. So my reflection this morning is of course not going to be tuned very well to your congregation's experience with the Green Sanctuary Program and any other things that you may be doing in that regard. It's more grounded, for my experience, in the larger discovery and experience within the Unitarian Universalist tradition at large around these kinds of issues. So I look forward, as the time evolves, to understand better where this congregation is in those projects. The actual core of what I wanted to talk about this morning came to me when a friend of mine he was cleaning out his library, as colleagues often do from time to time, and offered me a range of his books. And there was one I picked up that was called The Last Child in the Woods. I'm not sure if anybody happened to have read it. It's a couple years old now. And it caught my eye, and he said, oh, you're going to want to read that book. That's really important. So I took that along with me, with a few others. Probably should have given him a handful of books in trade, but there we go. And this piece actually had quite an impact on me. Richard Louv, L-O-U-V is his name, who wrote this. And as I say, the important piece of this is him looking at this idea of the last child in the woods. And he talks about that at this point in our history, children stand at great risk of what he calls nature deficit disorder. We have lots of other disorders that we have in this universe, but nature deficit disorder. And as I got peeling into the pages of the book, some of it was familiar to me, of course, but other things struck me with some startling discomfort. For instance, television viewing has gone up. The average child watches 170 minutes of television a day. 170 a day. That's nearly 3 hours of television a day. That's an average, of course. 9 times as much time is spent on physical activity, exercise. They are the realities of this transformation of communication that's, of course, taken over our culture, which claim in some ways to connect us to each other, but usually they isolate us even more. Add up to that fact that more than 80% of the American population, at least, live in urban communities. This is not one of them, as I look out and see Elsie the cow across the street, maybe, I don't know. But of course, our culture largely is, in so many ways, our population is settled in urban locations. And it's easy to see how over time the generations have become further and further disconnected from the land, from earth, from simply the changing patterns of the season. For a lot of people, I think that nature in some ways is understood as a commodity, something that you might experience as a kind of entertainment even. After all, in this day and age, you can go to a lot of shopping malls in our country and go rock climbing in the mall. Nature is the scenery in the backdrop sometimes. And for so many people, sometimes I even observe it in my own young adult children, aspects of nature become almost frightening. You'd think a spider was a dinosaur to my older daughter, but that may be a timeless factor. And another piece that I was astounded to find out in this book was between 1970 and 1990, that 20-year period. And this is where the last child in the woods metaphor comes in. In those 20 years, the radius around a person's home where children are allowed to roam freely has shrunk to a ninth of what it used to be in 1970. I don't know what it's gone to from now to then, but we all know lots of reasons why those limitations have become necessary for us in this day and age. But that's not immediately why the statistic is quite as significant, at least to me. Because if we do stop and just think about it a little bit, we're going to invite you to set your own clock back a little bit, however many decades it's necessary for you, to place yourself in your own days of childhood. Wherever that happened to have been, let's say when you're 8 or 9 years old. What kind of freedom did you have? And where did that allow you to roam, even? What places did you get to discover as if no one had ever been there before? Did you have a favorite creek where you floated leaves as if they were boats? Or maybe looked for little tadpoles under the rocks? Or maybe a small patch of woods not far from where you lived, which you imagined to be a great, vast forest. Where was it in your lives that you stumbled on wonder? I believe you each have a place that is going through your minds right now. And maybe in social hour we'll have a chance to trade those stories or where they might have been. The places where free-range childhood, as I call it, help give birth to your spirit. Just this last week, I'll confess, I do watch television, so not 170 minutes a day, perhaps, but, and there was a television commercial, I don't know if anyone else saw it, that caught my attention, in part because it was sort of fitting into some of what I was imagining talking about today. And when it first started, I wasn't even sure it was a commercial. There was a family of 4 shown driving out of this sort of large metropolitan area, and eventually kind of we're entering this sort of misty, dew-filled forest. And it was at that point the narration began, and it says, "There are times when our spirits call us back to nature." Well, the family was still in their car, and I kind of was wondering where this was going to go. Then the car stops, and the parents, they all get out for just a moment, but then the children get back in the car. And their narration says, "But not everyone has the same ideas about nature." And the kids get into the SUV, complete, I suspect, with Corinthian leather seats, and look glassy-eyed at the array of buttons and knobs and lights on the dashboard. They're dazed and amazed. And then the name of the automaker, which rhymes with bored, flashes on the screen. Pause, cut, next commercial. I kind of was amazed what I saw. I know it was just a commercial and I shouldn't get too exercised about it, but there were a few things that really made me worried, actually. For one thing, of course, it just showed that the only way to reach nature was in this mammoth SUV. Then I sort of got below that, and I'm like, well, The other thing that kind of I thought was strange was it was the children who were depicted as the decision makers in this family. They were the ones who wanted this snazzy vehicle, not the old croaky parents who were wandering around the woods. But what bothered me probably mostly was the unspeakable implication that it's just somehow not cool for kids to really pay much attention to nature. Those loser dweeb parents might have enjoyed wandering around and doing the, quote, nature thing, but the kid plunked back in the car watching a DVD on the drop-down screen of the SUV. Again, I know it's just a commercial, but it isn't just suggestive of a potential attitude that infiltrates our culture, but it's descriptive of an existing attitude, of course. And I don't think that's good news at all. 100 or more years ago, it was believed that there was such a thing as a, quote, nature cure. And although these locations and spas that were set up weren't necessarily above some of the quackery that we might laugh at with all kinds of strange diets and sulfur baths and spiritual hocus pocus perhaps, but fundamentally there was a recognition that there was something about being in the proximity and closeness of nature that was beneficial to the body, to the spirit. And they were right. A panoramic view, perhaps, of a mountain range isn't going to cure anyone of tuberculosis on its own, but it might provide that sense of balance and quiet and peace and strength that allows someone to live through healing through a disease. That whole idea of this nature cure is being borne out in a lot of research that's being done now. Kids with ADHD are often much more focused after a period of time playing outdoors. Depression, anxiety that they recognize, both in kids and adults, is reduced recognizably by even small amount of time spent in green spaces. Be that a backyard or a garden or a park or a walk on a tree-lined street. For me, there's a greenhouse just outside of Syracuse that I actually go and volunteer at once in a while, just for the chance to walk around those greenhouses and breathe in that wonderful, fresh, green space. And of course, we've all probably seen some of the good work that's been done with kids, high-risk kids who are taken on wilderness adventures, and the transformative experience that can happen for them in that kind of environment, both what they're able to experience within themselves and that which they soak up from around them. So is it possible to isolate the factors in nature that have that healing effect? Well, of course, there's no way to say and prescribe one thing or the other to any given person. And probably there never is. So we have to find it out for us, find out what really works for us, and not just because one fellow wrote a very captivating book on the subject that is rather convincing, at least to me. And so the question, of course, does roll right back to us, as every good question in the book ever does. And it comes back to not only those of us who may be parents in this world, but to everyone who lives with a sense of connection to the earth as our source and sustainer, which pauses and requires us to actually give some deeper thought of how it is that we're going to foster that sense of reverence and responsibility for all genders, not simply the children around us. I don't think it's really something that one can teach as in a specific guided curriculum, but I do think that what we are able to do as adults in a congregation such as this is model responsible decision-making for children around us, to be able to talk to our kids about things like that they may be wondering, such as, why is it that our yard has more dandelions in it than anyone else's on the street? What choices made to not obliterate them and all the creatures that live around them? To be able to allow kids to find a way to find their way into the world, to look and to touch and to dream, and to let somehow or other wonder, the kind of wonder that you all were perhaps remembering, to let that kind of wonder emerge. I know for me that a lot of that sense of wonder was found actually on a journey of self-discovery. Not something that somebody taught me, but rather that I had the time and the space to discover. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and we lived in the city in a neighborhood that was built in the probably 1920s, so the houses were fairly close together and fairly densely situated neighborhood. But adjacent to, we had lived on this little dead-end street, and just adjacent to us there was a city water tower up on this sort of drumlin. If any of you know the Syracuse area, we have drumlins on the east side, and so on this drumlin there was these water towers, and there was sort of a wooded area around it. And that was about maybe 30 yards from our front door to the base of this hill. And we just called it, amongst us kids, the woods, in quotation marks. And alone or with a pal, I spent a lot of time in those woods, looking for bugs, bringing them back in jars, startle my poor mother to death, climbing every tree we could find, though not politically correct now, playing Indians, trying to walk through the woods without making a sound, looking around to see if there might be fossils on the bottom of these rocks. And I can remember out to my mom that I'm going to the woods and letting the screen door slap shut. And I don't think she gave another thought to me until dinner. It was 1964, roughly, a perfectly reasonable playground for a child at that time. A kid living in that same neighborhood today, my guess, would find those woods off limits. And that, to me, is a great, great shame. Not necessarily that the woods had any notable flora or fauna to be cataloged or discovered, unless you consider sumac or squirrels a particularly rare and notable species. But it was, and I bet it still is, a kind of workshop for wonder. I sort of feel like I might be somehow distantly related to the writer Barbara Kingsolver, who wrote these words about her own 9-year-old self. She was describing her own quest in her life to learn more about the Cherokee people who had lived in the area she had grown up. And she read every single word that the library had on the subject. And then she went on to recall this. She said, "Long before I discovered Cherokee lore, I felt in a certain light that animals could talk. And I believed in trees, and that heaven had something to do with how dead trees gentle themselves into long mossy columns of bright-smelling, crumbling earth, lively inside with sprouting seeds and black beetles. I couldn't make myself believe in a loud-voiced, bearded God on his throne in the clouds, but I was moved to tears by a compost pile." I think she and I could get along. Those early kinds of encounters with wonder and the mystery that envelops and holds us into place were to me of inestimable value. And they came at a moment in life, in all of our lives, where our development, intellectually, socially, spiritually, is so much more receptive than we are as life goes on. It's just that simple. And so it's at that time that we're much more able to absorb this place we have in the world, as we learn about why it is that the leaves turn from green to red and gold, or why the moon comes and goes, and why the loon's call wakes us in the night in such an arresting way. Now, I don't have any beef at all with all that science and the understandings that it brings us fosters. Of course, it's foundational and it's just almost assumed. But it somehow pales in my eyes to the kind of awe that overtakes us in those moments where beauty and astonishment strike us speechless. The great 20th century mystic and teacher, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, taught his students this. He said that, quote, "Our goal as human beings should be to live a life of radical amazement." Radical amazement. He encouraged his students to take nothing for granted and to see everything as a rather astounding phenomenon. Incredible. He held that to be spiritual was to be forever amazed. Imagine what that actually would mean to all of us, to move through life with a kind of amazement, to be taking nothing for granted. In effect, to, of course, see all as sacred, even ourselves. I don't know exactly how one begins living such a life, but it's hard to actually argue against. Radical amazement, to me, suggests something that's really unconditional. It has no exceptions. It has no qualifications. It says, well, this is amazing and this is not quite. Could we allow ourselves to live in that kind of privilege? Could we give each other a kind of permission to suspend our critical minds and our judgmental selves and to accept amazement as the state of life? Might we try some small measure of amazement in our own daily life? And we don't have to necessarily go all whole hog on the first day. If you need to start out with, well, mild amazement, I guess that would be okay. Don't want anyone getting carried away. Maybe I'll take a walk this afternoon. Try just for a short time to see everything through the lens of amazement. Even if you don't think a tulip is amazing, pretend. Just humor me. It might even be good for you. But I suspect I have a clue of what will happen later on this afternoon. And some of you sitting here thinking, well, that kind of sounds like a good idea. Maybe I'll try that. But then the next thought is, but I really do have to mow the lawn. And that laundry, no one else is going to do it if I don't do it. And boy, a nap. Oh boy, a nap today. That'd be good. I come up with those because they're the ones that are in my mind as I stand here thinking about what happens when I get home. So probably by the end of the day, maybe 6 of you will have taken a walk, and 2 of the 6 will have forgotten to be amazed. Whatever. But just for the heck of it. And as a poorly disguised challenge, let me ask you, how many of you might indulge my suggestion to take a walk this afternoon and try just for a few minutes to be amazed? That's great. It's up to you. Think amazement. Think mystery. Think wonder. And if by any chance there's a spare kid around, take them on the walk with you. Because if you do something amazing, you can be sure that they won't. Onward we go.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.